The title we will be discussing today is the nonfiction book, Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo, which was written by Zora Neale Hurston and published posthumously. Barracoon is based on Hurston's 1927 interviews with Cudjoe Lewis, the last living survivor of the Atlantic slave trade. Cudjoe was abducted from Africa on the last black cargo ship to arrive in the U.S. The manuscript, which was in the Elaine Locke collection at the Moreland Spring Yarn Research Center at Howard University, remained unpublished until the 21st century. Excerpts from the book were first published in Wrapped in Rainbows, The Life of Zora Neale Hurston, a biography of Hurston by Valerie Boyd, and the full book was published this year. We'll draw a name to receive a complimentary copy of the book after our Q&A. And our guest reviewer today is Curtis K. Rivers. Curtis and his wife Marie are co-owners of Mood Makers Books, the independent African-American bookstore in Village Gate. Curtis is a playwright, artistic director of MMB Theater One Project, and founder and producer of the annual Sankofa Theater Festival. He's a native of Nashville, Tennessee, who served 4 years in the U.S. Air Force. He is retired from Eastman Kodak Company, where he worked for 28 years. And it is our absolute pleasure to welcome Mr. Rivers to our podium. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the library for giving me this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite authors, Zora Neale Hurston. If you have not read any of her books, my strong suggestion is that you leave here and read one of her books. Start with Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was an excellent book. There is so much in this book, and a number of surprises well, let me put it this way, things that I thought I knew about but did not know about. When I did the notes on the book, I ended up with 12 pages of notes. And I said to myself, well, I don't think I got that long. So what I'm going to do is hit some of the high points of the book and what I thought about it. And because I want to leave enough time for questions and answers, because I think that's very important with this particular book. So let me first get started by saying that the book itself is about 180 pages. It is not a hard read. It is not a very easy read, but once you start reading the book, and when she interviewed Cudjoe Lewis, he talks in broken English. So in the book, once you get past that, the broken English, and once you learn how he talks, it makes the book much more easy to read, because he ends up most of the time using the same words over and over again. So that makes the book easier to read. And what I'd like to do is just give you a little, I know some of you already know, but just a little background of Zora Neale Hurston. She was commissioned by Charlotte Mason to go to Alabama and interview Cudjoe. She was Charlotte was a mentor of Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was a publisher. She was an anthropologist and a folklorist. The greatest thing about Zora Neale was her being a folklorist, because what she would do is go to southern towns, interview southern people in the vernacular of their surroundings. She did not change the words, and you'll find out in this book, as we talk about it and go through it, that her interviewing style was completely different from other interviewers. Other interviewers use question and answer. Ask a question, give an answer. Hers was completely different in that she would sit with Cujo and listen to him. She would bring peaches, a ham, watermelon. And this was to befriend him, because during that time, Cujo had, all his family was just about gone, and he was living by himself. So when you look at the front of the book and you see a peach over in the corner, because when I first looked at this book and I went, now why they got a peach in the corner over here? But that is very important to the book, because what would happen is when she started to interview him, sometimes he would talk and be very lively, and other times he wouldn't. So sometimes they would just sit on the front porch and eat watermelon or peaches, and there would be no words passed between them. She'd get up and leave, and then, a couple of days later, she'd come back, and they'd do some of the same thing, and then he would want to talk. So her style was to get him to talk about himself and his elements. And that was different from other slave narratives that we are familiar with, like the narrative of Frederick Douglass, the founding pastor of AME Zion Church, James. Those narratives were of people who were in slavery. They grew up in slavery. So they had a different familiarity of slavery than did the 116 people that came from Africa later. So their narratives were how they got out of slavery, how they got free. His narrative was different from the standpoint because when he was brought here, he knew nothing really about American slavery. None of them knew anything about American slavery. So he never really thought about escaping slavery. What he and his people wanted to do was to go back to African soil. And that's what they called it, African soil. They were enslaved for 5 years, 5.5 years before emancipation. So let me see if I can go to this next slide. Okay. I should have been there, but that's all right. So the book Barracoon, the meaning of Barracoon, it's a Spanish word, and it means a hut, a building. But in Africa, it took on a whole different meaning. It meant a place where slaves were brought to stay until they could be shipped through the Middle Passage to America. So Barracoon took on a whole different meaning with Cujo and his group than it did as a Spanish word meaning housing. The transatlantic slave trafficking in 1807, Britain stopped trading in slaves. A year later, in 1808, well, it should be 1808, I said 1807 again, but maybe that was on purpose. And the reason I say it was on purpose is because the United States in 1808 followed suit and stopped trading in slaves. They had signed, there were laws and treaties that prohibited trading in slaves. But still, it was a lucrative business. Because although there were laws, the laws really didn't mean a lot. They still had a brisk slave trade. So the Homie people, and I'll get further into that in a few minutes, because there is a kind of a misconception about who dealt in slavery, who brought black people to the slave trade, and was it white people that that actually pushed this, or was it pushed from Africa? If you read the book, you'll find that there was a tribe, a nation called Fondahomie, and they were a huge slave trading nation in Africa. So slave trading was not only lucrative for the Americans and British and Europeans, it was also lucrative for those tribes that lived along the coast. And the Homie, I found out, was one of the leading traders in slaves. The Homie had signed a treaty that said that they would not slave trade again. But in 1852, they rescinded that and went back to trading in slaves again. For the simple reason, trading in slaves increased the wealth of the Dahomey tribe. That was part of their economics, was trading in slaves. When Dahomey decided to go back and started trading in slaves again, somehow or other, a report got back to Mobile, Alabama, from Africa, that the Dahomey king was now trading in slavery and had a brisk trade. Now, remember, this was after slavery had been abolished in the United States, but slaves were still coming through. There were, from 1801 to 1866, there were approximately 3.8 million slaves from Africa to the U.S. Now, when I heard that, I decided to go back and do some other research. So I went back, did some other research, and I found out all of those slaves didn't come in through the South. A lot of those slaves came in through the North and were shipped south. So this ship called the, hold on, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. These two slavers in Mobile, Alabama, thought that they could find a way to bring over about 130 slaves from the coast of West Africa. So they went to West Africa to the Dahomey tribe, and they bought 130 slaves. Now this is the interesting thing. They bought 130 slaves. The Dahomey king gave them all kinds of celebration and told them how great they were. And they were loading the slaves onto the ship. And the captain of the ship just happened to look out, and he saw the Dahomey warriors coming. And he knew that what they were going to do is recapture the slaves and hold the ship for ransom. So they hightailed it out. Here is where Cujo's story actually begins. He was in a village in Benin, and it was an agricultural village. And they were very peaceful people. Now, the Dahomey tribe, and the reason this is so fascinating to me because it tells me something about what the culture were in Africa as far as villages were concerned. The Dahomey tribe was a warrior-like tribe. They, and Cujo's tribe was peaceful. They didn't war. They were agricultural type people. But Dahomey's year was divided into two different areas. From December through, from November through January, they went to war. That was the first part. The second part of the year was festivals and sacrifices. This was very interesting. So they just didn't go to war to go to war. The Dahomey king had to have a reason for going to war. So he just didn't say, well, we're going to war, but there were enough tribes that he could stay in war, 6 months of the year, collect all of these slaves and get money. So he goes to Cujo's tribe, and I think he asked, they were raising corn or something, and he asked for half of the corn or whatever, and they didn't give it to him. That was his reason for going to war with them, because they had disrespected him. That's why they went to war. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there were, in Dahomey, they had a standing army of 12,000 soldiers. The interesting thing was that 5,000 of these soldiers were Amazons, which translated into women. How many saw Black Panther? Did you see Black Panther? Who were the warriors in Black Panther? The women. So what would happen is the women would go in to soften up the village, and then the men would come in and either take captives or the people that they didn't want to take captives, they cut their heads off. Okay? So I thought it was very interesting that in Black Panther, the women were the warriors. Let's go to the next slide here. So this was the back set for Cujo Lewis when he came to America. When he came to America, I think it was 106 of them that came to America. They came in at night in Mobile Bay, and they couldn't bring the slaves into Mobile, so they housed them off into an island and made the announcement that they had slaves, and you know, you could come and buy a slave if you like. And the slaves that were not sold, Captain Jim, which was one of the slavers, took them to his plantation. So they were slaves for 5.5 years. Now the interesting thing was that there were other slaves on the plantation. These slaves that were already on the plantation, that grew up in slavery, looked down on Cujo's people because they said that they were savages. And the reason they said they were savages is because they knew nothing about the slave culture here in the United States. So when emancipation came, they knew nothing about emancipation. And they were told that they were free. So Cujo and his band of people decided, oh, we're free. We can get a ship, and I'm paraphrasing, we can get a ship and go back to African soil. Because they never forgot that they wanted to go home to African soil. But here's the problem. They're in America now. And they didn't have money to go back to African soil. So what they decided to do as a group was to work and make money and buy their way back to Africa. The problem was they could not make enough money to go back to Africa. So now they are in America. In other words, they're in a strange land. They don't know the same customs as the other Africans who were slaves know, because they did not mix with them. So they go to Captain Jim, and they say to Captain Jim, Captain Jim, we want to go back to our homeland. And we don't have the money to do that. Can you help us do that? And Captain Jim said, no, I can't help you do it. Now I'm paraphrasing again. I can't help you do that. The only thing that you can do is work. So they decide to work. They go back to Captain Jim because of the two brothers that ran that plantation, Captain Jim seemed to be the one most likable and would listen to them. And they go back. This is their mentality. Why don't you give us half of Mobile as the land? And he said to them, I took care of you when you were in slavery. You're free now. You're on your own. If you want land, you got to work for it. So they work and they buy land from Captain Jim, which actually becomes Africa Town. And remnants of Africa Town is still in outside of Mobile. But here's the other problem. Since they did not know a lot about what went on in America, they were still kind of behind the 8 ball. And I was telling a friend of mine, and it's the same way today. Black people are still behind the 8 ball because there's a whole bunch of things we don't know are kept from us. Let's put it this way, are kept from us. Not that we don't know, but are kept from us. So what happens is they befriend an African slave, and he tells them, well, you know, you got to get organized. You got to get a religion. So they decide to build a building, our church. And they do build a building, our church. And they form their own type of religion, which was actually built on their homeland, not American religion. But the interesting thing is they did call it a Baptist church, which I thought was kind of interesting. So they do that. They're trying their best to fit in and learn what's going on in America. So now they have to organize. They need a leader, and they choose a leader. They choose a leader. Cujo Lewis decides that he wants to get married. So he finds a person to marry, a woman to marry. But then he was told, well, you can't marry like you married in Africa. You have to get a license. So he goes and he gets the license to get married. I think they have 5 or 6 kids. But during his story, as he tells his story, and this is from my point of view, he was not only telling his personal story, he was telling the story of the whole village, the whole tribe. He just happened to have been the one telling the story. Zora Neale Hurston would go and she would sit with him. And like I said before, sometimes they would just sit and eat in silence. He'd sit in his rocking chair and rock, and she'd sit and be silent. And then other times he would go and she would go, and he would be very talkative. I'm going to go through a couple other things and then go, ooh, our time is going. Jesus Christ. Excuse me. Key points. If you have not read the book, one of the things you should read is the foreword by Alice Walker, because the foreword by Alice Walker actually sets the tone for the book itself. You should also read the introduction by Deborah Plant, and read the introduction by Zora Neale Hurston, because it gives you some background in how she conducted the interviews. And as I said before, Cujo Lewis telling of his story in his own words. Now, when she went to her publisher to have this book published, the publisher looked at the book. First of all, they didn't want to publish it because I think it was just a little too controversial back in the 30s for them to publish. But the other thing they wanted to do is to smooth the book down, and that is for her to change the language and use proper English. From my standpoint, if she did that, that would destroy the story, because then the story is not a natural story coming from an enslaved person. It's been edited, and she would not do that. So the book never really got published. Excerpts of the book were published, but the book never really got published, so it lay dormant for some 70 years. The other thing you should really look at is the glossary in the book. because there's a wealth of information in the glossary. And why it took me so long to read the book, because I was going back and forth from the book to the glossary. The other thing I found fascinating was the founders and the original residents of African Town, and they are listed in the back of the book. And make sure you look at the notes and the research that she did. She did a lot of research on this book, but there was a lot of controversy too, because some of her critics said that she used research from other people, because it was never proved. My thinking on that is, if you're researching, 9 times out of 10, if you're researching other people, you're going to use something from that research. That doesn't mean that you are plagiarizing their books. Now, one of the questions that when you guys sent me the letter was, is there anything in this book that relates to Rochester? And I'm looking back in the glossary and the meanings, and lo and behold, what did I come up on? There was a meaning for the Maafa. The Maafa is a Swahili term that means disaster and the human response to it. Now, I've underlined some words: disaster and the human response to it. It means, from an African perspective, disruption, uprooting, exploitation, and trafficking. Here in Rochester, I belong to the Maafa Celebration Committee. And once a year, let me go to that one. Once a year, we do the Day of Remembrance. The Day of Remembrance is when we recognize all of those slaves that came through the Middle Passage and did not make it to America. Nate, let me just pause for a minute. That really gets on my nerves. You know your phone, when your phone starts talking to you? My phone was just talking to me. But the Day of Remembrance is celebrated on the 9th of June, and it's celebrated out at Durand Eastman Park by the lake. And it's a celebration remembering our ancestors. And during this celebration, there's a libation. You go down to the water with flowers, and you throw the flowers into the water, which remembers someone that did not make it here. Next year, I'm inviting all of you to come to the Maafa. And it's not only celebrated here in Rochester. We've been celebrating it here in Rochester for 20 years. But it's celebrated on June 9th all over the country. And I think about 2 or 3 years ago, there was monuments placed in the Atlantic Ocean to memorize, to help memorize those people who came over. There's a whole bunch I could say about this. I didn't go halfway through this. It is a fascinating book, a fascinating read, and what it did for me, it made me want to go and do more research. Because without books like this, we will never, ever know about these people. We will never, ever know about each other. Because whether you will admit it or not, those people, that 106 people that came over on that boat after slavery is also a part of me, you, and everybody that's in this room. I'll take questions right now. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Any descendants of that group live in this area?
No, they were all in Mobile, Alabama, and it wasn't that big of a group of them. In the book, it says